The crackling sound of flames devouring wood was the only warning Hannah Dawson had before her modest homestead erupted into an inferno. Clutching 5-year-old Ellie to her chest, she stumbled backward from the burning cabin, her lungs filling with acrid smoke as the hungry fire consumed everything she'd worked for over the past 7 years. "Mama, my bear." Ellie screamed, his small body twisting in her arms as he reached toward the flames. The stuffed toy, sewn together from scraps of his father's old shirts after the fever took him 2 winters ago, was the only memento he had left. "No, Illy." Hannah tightened her grip, pulling him back as a beam crashed through the roof, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "It's just a thing, baby. We've got each other." The heat pressed against them like a physical force, driving them further back across the dusty yard. Hannah's legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, instinctively curling her body around her son. Her cotton dress offered little protection from the flying embers, and she felt a sharp sting as one landed on her shoulder. Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean paths through the layer of soot that had settled on her skin. This homestead was all they had left after Samuel's death, the land they'd staked their claim on, the future they'd planned together. Now, like everything else in her life, it was disappearing before her eyes. "Illy, when I tell you to run, you go straight for that big oak tree," she whispered, pointing to the gnarled silhouette in the distance. "You stay there until morning, you understand? Not without you, Mama." His voice was small, frightened, but determined. Before she could respond, the sound of galloping hooves cut through the crackling of the flames. Hannah's heart seized with fresh fear. Bandits. It had to be. News of attacks on isolated homesteads had been spreading through the territory for months. First the fire, and now this, as if the cruel hand of fate hadn't taken enough already. Hannah pressed Ellie's face against her chest, shielding him from whatever was coming. She had nothing to defend them with, not even a kitchen knife. Everything was inside the burning house. But she'd fight with her bare hands if she had to. The rider emerged from the darkness, his broad-shouldered silhouette backlit by the flames. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the ground. Hannah couldn't make out his face beneath the wide brim of his hat, but she could see the gleam of a pistol on his hip. "Please," she whispered, not knowing if he could hear her over the roar of the fire. "My son." The stranger approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. As he drew closer, the firelight revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind, startlingly blue against his tanned skin. "Madam," he called, voice deep and steady, "you're both gonna get scorched out here." Hannah tried to stand to back away, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The stranger closed the distance between them with quick strides, dropping to one knee beside her. "Name's Yates Valero, madam. Ranch is about 3 miles east of here." He glanced at the burning cabin, then back to her and Ellie. "This your place?" Hannah nodded, unable to find her voice as another wall collapsed behind them, sending a wave of heat washing over them. Yates didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his duster and draped it around her shoulders. "Fire's spreading fast. Wind'll carry it to the grass soon." As if to punctuate his warning, a gust sent a flurry of embers swirling across the yard, igniting patches of dry prairie grass. She tried to shield her son from the fire. Yates muttered, almost to himself, his expression darkening with something that looked like respect. Then louder, "You're both coming home with me." Hannah clutched Ellie tighter, instinctive distrust warring with desperate need. "I don't know you, Mr. Valero." "No, madam, you don't. But that fire doesn't care one way or another, and I'm not leaving a woman and child out here to face it alone." He held out his hands toward Ellie. "May I?" Before Hannah could protest, Ellie surprised her by reaching for Yates. The tall cowboy lifted him with practiced ease, settling him securely in one arm before extending his other hand to Hannah. "Trust me just long enough to get you somewhere safe," he said. "After that, you can decide what's next." Hannah took his hand, feeling the calluses against her palm as he pulled her to her feet. Her legs were shaky, and she stumbled against him, mortified by her own weakness. "I've got you," Yates said simply, steadying her with a firm grip on her elbow. "Horse is just over there. Can you ride?" Hannah nodded. Growing up on a farm in Missouri, she'd been riding since before she could walk. Yates led them to his horse, a magnificent bay stallion that stood calmly despite the chaos around them. "Up you go," he said, lifting Illy onto the saddle first. "Hold tight to the horn, little man." Illy wrapped his small hands around the saddle horn, his eyes wide but dry. Hannah had always marveled at her son's quiet courage, so like his father's. Yates helped Hannah up behind her son, then mounted behind them both in one smooth motion. His arms came around them as he took the reins, creating a secure circle that felt oddly comforting. Hiya. With a gentle kick, the horse surged forward, putting distance between them and the burning homestead. Hannah couldn't help looking back as they rode away, watching as flames consumed the last physical reminder of her life with Samuel. 7 years of memories, reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. The weight of it crashed over her, and a sob escaped before she could stop it. She felt Yates's chest expand against her back as he drew a deep breath. "I'm sorry about your home, madam, truly." "Hannah," she said quietly, her voice rough from smoke. "Hannah Dawson, and this is Illy." "Illy?" Yates repeated, his voice gentling. "That's a good, strong name for a brave young man." They rode in silence after that, the rhythmic gait of the horse and the steady presence of the stranger lulling Illy to sleep against Hannah's chest. The night air was cool away from the fire, and Hannah was grateful for the warmth of Yates's duster around her shoulders. The moon had climbed higher in the sky by the time they crested a small rise, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley below. A large main house stood in the center with several outbuildings clustered nearby. Lamplight glowed in a few windows, a beacon of warmth in the darkness. "Welcome to Valero Ranch," Yates said, a note of pride in his deep voice. "Not much, but it's home, not much." Hannah almost laughed. The ranch was easily 10 times the size of her homestead, with more land than she'd ever dreamed of owning. Even in the darkness, she could make out the shapes of cattle in the distant pastures. As they approached the main house, a dog began barking, and a moment later, the front door swung open. A woman with silver-streaked hair stepped onto the porch, a shotgun held casually in her hands. "That you, Yates?" she called. "It's me, Maggie. Put that scattergun away, we've got guests." The woman Maggie lowered the shotgun and squinted into the darkness. "Guests at this hour." As they drew closer, her expression shifted from suspicion to concern. "Lord above, what happened?" "Fire," Yates said simply, reining his horse to a stop in front of the porch. "Their place is gone." Maggie's weathered face softened. "Poor dears, bring them inside, quick, I'll put some coffee on." Yates dismounted first, then reached up for Illy, who was still fast asleep. "I'll take him, if that's all right." Hannah nodded, reluctantly relinquishing her son into the cowboy's capable hands. She tried to dismount on her own, but her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground. Yates shifted Illy to one arm and caught her with the other, his strength the only thing keeping her from collapsing. "Easy now," he murmured. "You've been through hell tonight." Hannah wanted to protest that she was fine, that she didn't need his help, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself leaning into him as he guided her up the porch steps and into the warmth of the ranch house. The interior was simple but comfortable, polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled cheerfully. It was so at odds with the destructive flames they'd just escaped that Hannah felt momentarily disoriented. "Sit her down here," Maggie directed, gesturing to a rocking chair near the fire. "Poor thing's in shock." She disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a quilt that she tucked around Hannah's shoulders. "There now. You just rest while I get something hot in you." Yates had settled Illy on a sofa, the boy curling into the cushions without waking. Hannah reached out a trembling hand toward her son. "He's safe," Yates assured her, his voice low. "You both are." Hannah looked up at him, seeing him clearly for the first time in the warm lamplight. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with sun-streaked brown hair and those striking blue eyes. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the short beard that covered his chin. There was something solid about him, reliable, like the mountains that framed the horizon. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Yates crouched down beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers. "Why what, Mrs. Dawson? Why help us? You don't know us." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Out here we help our neighbors, that's how folks survive." He nodded toward the window, where the night sky still glowed orange in the distance. Besides, no one should face something like that alone. Before Hannah could respond, Maggie returned with a tray bearing 3 steaming mugs and a plate of biscuits. Here we are. Coffee for you and Yates, and some warm milk with honey for the little one when he wakes. She set the tray on a small table. Now I've made up the guest room for you and your boy. You can get cleaned up and rest, and we'll sort everything else out in the morning. Hannah stared at the coffee, then at the kind faces of these strangers who had opened their home to her without question. The enormity of what she'd lost, and what might have happened if Yates hadn't come along, hit her all at once. A sob tore from her throat, followed by another, and then she was crying in earnest, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "Oh, honey," Maggie said, setting aside the coffee and wrapping an arm around Hannah's shoulders. "Let it out. You're allowed to fall apart a little." Yates stood back, his expression pained as he watched her grief pour out. After a moment, he quietly excused himself, disappearing through the front door. Hannah cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned, until there were no tears left. Through it all, Maggie held her, murmuring soothing nonsense and stroking her hair as if she were a child. When the storm finally passed, leaving Hannah empty and exhausted, Maggie pressed a handkerchief into her hands. "There now. You'll feel better for having let it out." She picked up the mug of coffee, now lukewarm, and pressed it into Hannah's hands. "Drink this, then we'll get you cleaned up." Hannah sipped the coffee mechanically, her eyes drifting to Ali, who had somehow slept through her breakdown. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered. "Everything we had was in that house." "One step at a time," Maggie said firmly. "Tonight you sleep, tomorrow you think, day after that you decide." She patted Hannah's hand. "And until then, you've got a roof over your head and food on the table. The rest will sort itself out." The door opened and Yates stepped back inside, his arms full of clothing. "Found some things that might fit," he said, setting the bundle on a chair. "They're clean at least." Hannah looked at the clothes, then back at Yates. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. He nodded, his eyes kind. "Get some rest, Mrs. Dawson. Dawn comes early around here and there'll be plenty to do." As he turned to leave, Hannah called after him. "Mr. Valero," he paused, looking back. "Yes." "It's just Hannah, Mrs. Dawson. That was for a life I'm not sure exists anymore." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the particular kind of grief that comes with redefinition. "Hannah, then, sleep well." After he left, Maggie helped Hannah to the guest room, a small but comfortable space with a large bed that would easily fit her and Ali. Yates carried the still sleeping boy in, laying him gently on the bed before retreating with a quiet good night. Left alone with her son, Hannah sank onto the edge of the bed, too numb to do more than remove her ash-covered shoes and outer clothing before crawling under the quilts beside Ali. She pulled him close, breathing in the smoke-tinged scent of his hair, and finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. Her last conscious thought was of Yates Valero's steady blue gaze and the strange sense of safety she'd felt in his arms as they rode away from the ruins of her past. Hannah woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling above her. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns across a patchwork quilt. The events of the previous night came rushing back: the fire, the stranger on horseback, the quiet ranch house. She turned to check on Ali, panic flaring when she found the space beside her empty. Throwing back the covers, she scrambled out of bed, calling his name as she rushed to the door. Before she could reach it, the door swung open to reveal Maggie, a pile of clean clothing in her arms. "Good morning, dear. Your little man's already up and about." "Been helping Yates with the morning chores for near an hour now." She smiled at Hannah's disheveled appearance. "You needed the rest. Coffee's hot in the kitchen when you're ready." Hannah's panic subsided, replaced by a pang of guilt. She hadn't slept past sunrise since before Ali was born. "I should have been up." "Nonsense," Maggie interrupted, laying the clothes on the bed. "Found these in the trunk. They belonged to my daughter Betsy before she married and moved to Denver. Should fit you well enough until we can get into town for something proper." Hannah ran her fingers over the simple cotton dress. It was finer than anything she'd owned, with tiny blue flowers embroidered around the collar. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will, Maggie said firmly. Now, there's wash water in the pitcher and a comb on the dresser. Take your time getting presentable. Breakfast'll wait. Left alone again, Hannah did as she was told, grateful for the opportunity to wash away the ash and smoke that still clung to her skin. The cool water revived her, and by the time she'd dressed in the borrowed clothes and pinned her dark hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, she felt almost human again. The main room of the ranch house was empty when she emerged, but she followed the sound of voices to the kitchen at the back of the house. The sight that greeted her there stopped her in her tracks. Illy sat at a large wooden table, his legs swinging freely as he attacked a plate of flapjacks with enthusiasm. Across from him sat Yates, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he leaned forward, listening with apparent fascination as Illy explained something with animated gestures. Maggie stood at the stove, her back to the door as she flipped another batch of flapjacks. It was so domestic, so normal, that Hannah felt like an intruder until Illy spotted her. "Mama," he cried, scrambling down from his chair and racing to her. "Mr. Yates showed me the horses and the cows and the chickens, and I helped feed them, and he says I can ride a pony if you say it's okay." Hannah lifted him into a hug, breathing in the scent of him hay and sunshine and maple syrup now, rather than smoke. Did he now? She looked over Illy's head at Yates, who had risen from the table when she entered. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Hope you slept well." Hannah was struck again by how different he looked in daylight, younger, less forbidding, though no less solid. He'd exchanged his dusty clothes from the night before for clean one's dark trousers, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to expose tanned forearms, and a leather vest. "I did, thank you," she replied, setting Illy back down. "And thank you for entertaining my son. No trouble at all." Yates's smile transformed his face, softening the weathered lines. "Boy's a natural with the animals, got away with them." "Just like his pa," Hannah said softly, then wished she hadn't when an awkward silence fell. Maggie broke it, turning from the stove with a fresh plate of flapjacks. "Sit down, Hannah. You need to get something in your stomach." She set the plate on the table with a meaningful look. Hannah obeyed, settling into the chair next to her son. Maggie poured her coffee, then resumed her place at the stove while Yates returned to his own seat. "I was just telling Illy about the ranch," Yates said, passing her the syrup. "Been in my family for 3 generations now. It's impressive," Hannah said honestly. "You run it alone, not exactly. Got a foreman, Hank, and 3 hands who live in the bunkhouse." Yates took a sip of his coffee. "Maggie here's been keeping house since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Somebody has to keep this boy fed," Maggie said with affection. "Lord knows he'd live on jerky and coffee if left to his own devices." Hannah watched the easy rapport between them, feeling a familiar ache. Once she and Samuel had bantered like that over breakfast, planning their day on the homestead, dreaming of the ranch it would become once they'd proved up on the claim. As if reading her thoughts, Yates set down his mug. "After breakfast, I thought we might ride back to your place. See what's salvageable." The flapjack turned to ash in Hannah's mouth. She swallowed with difficulty. "I'm not sure there's anything left." "Won't know until we look," Yates said gently. "And either way, you'll need to make some decisions." Hannah nodded, pushing her plate away. Her appetite had vanished at the thought of returning to the charred remains of her home. "Yes, of course. I can watch the little one while you go," Maggie offered, bringing another plate of flapjacks to the table. "We'll bake cookies, won't we, Illy?" Illy, who had been following the adult conversation with a child's half-interest, perked up at the mention of cookies. "Can we, Mama, please?" Hannah hesitated. She'd rarely been separated from Illy, especially since Samuel's death. But the thought of him seeing the devastation, possibly being upset by it. "All right, if you're sure it's no trouble, Maggie." "No trouble at all," Maggie ruffled Illy's dark hair. "This one's a delight." After breakfast, Yates disappeared to saddle the horses while Hannah helped Maggie clear the table. The older woman worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before speaking. "He's a good man, you know." Hannah looked up from the dish she was drying. "Yates," Maggie nodded. "Known him since he was born, watched him grow up, turn into a man his father would have been proud of." She glanced out the window, where Yates could be seen leading 2 horses from the barn. Lost his own family too young, understands what it is to start over. Before Hannah could ask what she meant, Ellie burst into the kitchen, clutching a wooden horse that looked well-loved. "Mr. Yates says to tell you the horses are ready," he announced. "And he said I could play with this until he makes me a new one." He held up the toy proudly. Hannah knelt to examine it. The carving was simple but skillful, with flowing lines that captured the spirit of a galloping horse. "It's very nice of Mr. Yates to share his toys with you." "Oh, he's always carving something," Maggie said with a fond smile. "Says it helps him think." "That horse there is one of his earlier attempts, I'd wager." Hannah looked out the window again, a new appreciation for the rancher blooming alongside her gratitude. It was a rare man who would not only rescue strangers from a fire, but also think to comfort a child with a toy. "I should go," she said, rising to her feet. "Illy, you be good for Miss Maggie, you hear?" "Yes, Mama." Illy was already distracted by the wooden horse, making it gallop across the kitchen table. Hannah stepped onto the porch to find Yates waiting with two saddled horses, his bay stallion from the night before and a gentle-looking chestnut mare. "Figured you'd be more comfortable on Daisy here," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's got an easy gait and the temperament of a lamb." Hannah approached the horse, offering her palm for the mare to sniff. "She's beautiful. She's yours for as long as you need her," Yates said, the simple generosity of the gesture catching Hannah off guard. "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will," Yates interrupted, unconsciously echoing Maggie's words from earlier. "Can't have you and your boy stranded out here with no way to get around." Before Hannah could argue further, he offered his cupped hands as a mounting aid. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her foot in his hands and allowed him to boost her onto the saddle. They rode in companionable silence for the first mile, the morning sun warming their backs as they followed a well-worn trail across the rolling prairie. Hannah found herself sneaking glances at her companion, noting the easy way he sat in the saddle, the quiet confidence in his bearing. "Been meaning to ask," Yates said eventually, breaking the silence. "What started the fire?" Hannah sighed, her hands tightening on the reins. "I'm not entirely sure. I was putting Ellie to bed when I smelled the smoke. By the time I got to the main room, the wall behind the stove was already ablaze." She shook her head. "It spread so quickly. I barely had time to grab Ellie before the roof started coming down." Yates nodded, his expression grim. "Prairie fires are like that, unforgiving, if you hadn't come along." Hannah didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. "But I did," Yates said simply, "and here we are." The simplicity of his response struck Hannah. No false modesty, no grand declarations, just the plain fact of his presence when it mattered most. They crested a rise, and suddenly the remains of Hannah's homestead came into view. In daylight, the devastation was even more apparent than it had been by moonlight. The cabin was reduced to a blackened skeleton, its walls collapsed into piles of charred timber. The small barn was gone entirely, leaving only a scorched patch of earth. Hannah reined in her horse, her throat constricting at the sight. Everything they'd worked for, every piece of their life together, reduced to ash and rubble. Yates stopped beside her, his face solemn. "I'm sorry, Hannah," she swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at the destruction. 7 years, she said quietly. "Samuel and I came out here with nothing but a wagon and dreams, built that cabin with our own hands, log by log." A bitter laugh escaped her. "And now it's gone, just like him." "Your husband?" Yates asked gently. Hannah nodded. "Fever took him 2 winters ago. Left me with a 3-year-old boy and a homestead to run." She straightened her shoulders. "I managed. We were doing all right." "You'll manage again," Yates said with quiet confidence. "You strike me as the type." His faith in her, unearned as it was, gave Hannah the strength to nudge her horse forward. They approached the ruins slowly, Yates hanging back slightly to give her space. As they drew closer, Hannah was struck by how little remained. The stone chimney stood like a sentinel among the rubble, but everything else was unrecognizable. The vegetable garden she'd tended so carefully was trampled and scorched, the wooden fence around it nothing but cinders. She dismounted carefully, handing the reins to Yates before picking her way through the debris. The heat had dissipated, but the ground was still warm beneath her borrowed boots. She stopped at what had once been the front door, now just a gap in the fallen timbers. "Be careful," Yates called, his voice tight with concern. "Structure's not stable." Hannah nodded absently, her eyes scanning the ruins for anything familiar, anything salvageable. A glint of metal caught her eye, and she carefully moved a charred board to reveal Samuel's old tin coffee cup, blackened but intact. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Such a small thing, insignificant really, but the sight of it, this one surviving piece of their life together, broke something inside her. Tears welled up, spilling silently down her cheeks. A warm hand settled on her shoulder. "We don't have to do this now," Yates said, his voice low and gentle. "We can come back when you're ready." Hannah wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her show of weakness. "No, I need to see what's left." They spent the next hour sifting through the ruins, salvaging what they could: a cast iron skillet, a few tools from the lean-to shed that had partially survived, a small wooden box containing Samuel's pocket watch and wedding band. So little to show for a life built with such hope. Yates worked alongside her without complaint, his strength making short work of the heavier debris. He was careful, Hannah noticed, treating each recovered item as if it were precious, regardless of its actual value. When they had searched every accessible corner of the ruins, Yates helped Hannah arrange the salvaged items on a blanket he'd brought. Looking at the pitiful collection, Hannah felt hollow. "It's not much," she said, voice flat. "It's a start," Yates countered. He hesitated, then asked, "Hannah, what were your plans before the fire? For you and Ali?" The question caught her off guard. "Plans? Winter's coming," he said. "Were you going to stay here or?" Hannah hadn't allowed herself to think about it. After Samuel died, she'd focused solely on survival, on getting through each day. "I don't know," she admitted. "The claim's not proved up yet. We've still got another 3 years before the land is truly ours." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "Any family you could go to?" "My parents died before Lee was born. My brother's out in California somewhere, but I haven't heard from him in years." Hannah wrapped her arms around herself. "Samuel was all the family I had, and now Lee is all that's left." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. "You could stay," he said finally, "at the ranch, until you figure things out." Hannah stared at him, the offer both unexpected and overwhelming. "I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition," Yates interrupted. "Place is too big for just me and Maggie anyway, and Ali, well, he seems happy there." Hannah thought of her son's bright eyes that morning, his excitement over the animals and Yates's carved horse. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You don't know us." Yates looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "Out here, people help each other. It's how we survive." It was the same thing he'd said last night, but this time, Hannah sensed there was more to it, something personal that drove his generosity. "Besides," he continued with a small smile, "having a youngster around might be good for the place, bring some life back into it." Hannah hesitated. Pride warred with practicality in her mind. She had always been fiercely independent, determined to make her own way. But what choice did she have now? Winter was indeed coming, and rebuilding the cabin before the first snow would be nearly impossible on her own. "Just until spring," she said finally. "By then I'll have figured out what's next." Yates nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, just until spring." They gathered the salvaged items into saddlebags and prepared to leave, but Hannah found herself lingering, reluctant to abandon the place that had been her home for so long. "We can come back," Yates said, reading her hesitation. "Check on things, maybe salvage more as the ashes cool." Hannah nodded, grateful for his understanding. With one last look at the ruins of her homestead, she mounted Daisy and followed Yates back toward the ranch, leaving behind the ashes of one life and heading toward the uncertain promise of another. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment as Hannah and Elise settled into life at Valero Ranch. Yates insisted they continue to use the guest room, brushing aside Hannah's protests with a casual, plenty of space to go around. Maggie seemed delighted to have another woman in the house, especially one who was handy with a needle. Hannah quickly made herself useful, mending shirts and patching quilts in the evenings while Ellie played with his wooden horse at her feet. On the fourth morning, Hannah rose early, determined to pull her weight. She found Maggie already in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. "Let me help," Hannah said, rolling up her sleeves. Maggie smiled, pushing a strand of silver hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Coffee's just about ready. Cups are in the cupboard to the left." Hannah poured 2 cups, handing one to Maggie before settling into the rhythm of the older woman's kitchen. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft thump of dough on the floured board. "Where's Yates this morning?" Hannah asked eventually, noticing his absence. "Rode out before dawn," Maggie replied. Fence line on the north pasture needed mending, according to Hank. Hannah had met the foreman briefly, a taciturn man with iron-gray hair and a limp from an old injury. He seemed competent and respectful, if not particularly warm. "Does he always work so hard?" Hannah asked, thinking of how Yates had been the first up and last to bed every day since they arrived. Maggie chuckled. "That boy's never known any other way. His daddy was the same, up with the sun, down with the moon, and every minute in between spent tending this land." She shaped the dough into loaves and placed them in greased pans. "Got worse after he lost Claire, though." Hannah's hand stilled. "Claire?" Maggie's face softened with old grief. "His wife, been gone 5 years now. Childbirth took her and the baby both." The revelation hit Hannah like a physical blow. Yates had been married, had almost been a father. No wonder he'd seemed so at ease with Ellie, so understanding of her loss. "I had no idea," she said softly. "Not something he talks about much," Maggie said, setting the bread pans aside to rise. "But it explains why he brought you here, I think. Man knows what it is to have your world turned upside down in an instant." Before Hannah could respond, the back door swung open and Ellie burst in, followed more sedately by Yates. Both were flushed from the cold morning air, their breath forming small clouds in the warmth of the kitchen. "Mama," Ellie cried, racing to her side. "Mr. Yates showed me how to mend fences. I held the nails for him and everything." Hannah smiled, ruffling his hair. "Did you now?" "Sounds like important work." "It is," Ellie nodded emphatically. "Mr. Yates says a ranch can't run without good fences." "Mr. Yates is absolutely right," Hannah agreed, glancing up to find the rancher watching them with a slight smile. "Boy's a quick learner," Yates said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Might make a rancher of him yet." Ellie beamed at the praise, puffing out his small chest. "Can I go tell Miss Maggie about the coyote we saw?" Hannah nodded, and Ellie scampered off to where Maggie was setting out plates for breakfast. Left alone with Yates, Hannah found herself suddenly shy, hyper-aware of his presence in a way she hadn't been before. "Thank you for including him," she said, focusing on straightening the already neat row of coffee mugs. "No hardship," Yates replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Boy's good company." Hannah hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Maggie told me about your wife. I'm sorry for your loss." Yates went still, his cup halfway to his lips. For a moment, Hannah thought she'd overstepped, but then he set the cup down with a careful deliberation. "Thank you," he said simply. "Claire was special, would have made a wonderful mother." The quiet pain in his voice resonated with Hannah's own grief. "It doesn't really go away, does it? The missing them?" Yates met her eyes, a flash of recognition passing between them. "No, but it changes, becomes something you can carry without it crushing you." Hannah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The raw agony of Samuel's death had gradually transformed into a more manageable ache, always present, but no longer all-consuming. "I'd better get cleaned up before breakfast," Yates said, breaking the moment. He hesitated, then added, "Thought I might ride into town later. Need anything?" Hannah thought of her meager possessions, most still packed in the saddlebags they'd brought from the homestead. "Some fabric, perhaps. I'd like to make Ellie some new clothes and maybe." She gestured vaguely at the borrowed dress she wore. "Write a list," Yates said with a nod. "I'll see what Mrs. Patterson at the general store can put together." After breakfast, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper, carefully noting the items they needed most urgently. Ellie had gone with Maggie to gather eggs, leaving Hannah alone with her thoughts. She was just adding thread to the list when Yates appeared in the doorway, dressed for riding in his duster and hat. "List ready?" he asked, crossing to the table. Hannah handed it to him, suddenly embarrassed by the length. "I've added the cost next to each item. I don't have much cash, but I can work to pay it back. Yates scanned the list, then folded it and tucked it into his pocket without comment on her offer to repay him. Might be back after dark. Tell Maggie not to wait dinner. He turned to go, but Hannah caught his sleeve. Wait, she swallowed, gathering her courage. I wanted to thank you for everything. I don't know what we would have done without your help. Yates looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of lips. No need for thanks, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Anyone would have done the same. No, Hannah said firmly, not anyone. What you've done for us. It's extraordinary, Yates. His name on her lips seemed to affect him. He drew a sharp breath, and for a moment, Hannah thought he might say something more. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, giving it a gentle squeeze before releasing it. Back before dark, he repeated, and then he was gone, the sound of his boots on the porch boards fading into the distance. Hannah stared at the empty doorway, her hand still warm where he'd touched it. What was happening to her? She'd known this man less than a week, and yet something about him resonated with her in a way no one had since Samuel. Guilt followed the thought immediately. Samuel had been dead barely 2 years. Was she so fickle that her heart could turn so quickly to another? No, she told herself firmly. She was simply grateful to Yates for his kindness. The flutter in her stomach when he looked at her, the warmth that spread through her at his touch, these were natural responses to a handsome man who had shown her kindness. Nothing more. But even as she busied herself with household tasks throughout the day, Hannah couldn't quite shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them that morning. And more unsettling still was the realization that she wasn't entirely sure she wanted things to go back to the way they were before. True to his word, Yates returned after dark, his horse's hooves crunching on the gravel outside the house just as Hannah was tucking Ellie into bed. The boy had exhausted himself helping Maggie in the garden and feeding the chickens, and he was already half asleep when the sound came. "Is that Mr. Yates?" he mumbled, fighting to keep his eyes open. "I think so," Hannah replied, smoothing the quilt over him. "You'll see him in the morning." "Promise to tell him I didn't forget to check the henhouse like he showed me," Hannah smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "I promise. Now sleep, my little helper." She stayed until his breathing deepened, then quietly left the room, pulling the door partially closed behind her. In the main room, she found Yates setting down several packages on the table while Maggie fussed over the state of his duster. "Looks like you rode through a dust storm," the older woman was saying, brushing at his shoulders. "Did you forget to use the road?" Yates chuckled, the sound warming the room. "Cut across the Miller place, saved an hour. And brought half their topsoil with you," Maggie grumbled, but there was no heat in her words. "I've kept a plate warm for you in the oven. Hannah, be a dear and fetch it while I make fresh coffee." Hannah moved to comply, aware of Yates's eyes following her as she crossed to the kitchen. When she returned with his dinner, he had removed his hat and duster and was seated at the table, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him yet. "Got everything on your list," he said as she set the plate before him. "And a few extra things Mrs. Patterson thought you might need." Hannah eyed the packages curiously. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Yates said firmly, picking up his fork. "Consider it a welcome gift." "But Hannah," he looked up at her, his expression serious. "Please, let me do this." Something in his tone stopped her protest. Instead, she sat across from him, watching as he ate with the hearty appetite of a man who'd spent the day in the saddle. "Illy wanted me to tell you he didn't forget to check the henhouse," she said after a moment. Yates smiled around a mouthful of stew. "Good boy. Found any more eggs after I left?" "3," Hannah confirmed. He was very proud, as he should be. Boys got a knack for finding the ones the hens try to hide. Yates took a drink of the coffee Maggie had placed beside him. "Saw Parson Miller in town. Sunday service is day after tomorrow if you're interested." Hannah hesitated. She hadn't been to church since Samuel's funeral, finding more comfort in private prayer than in the congregation's well-meaning but often painful sympathy. "Perhaps," she said non-committally. Yates nodded, accepting her uncertainty without question. No pressure. "Just thought you might like to know." After he finished eating, Yates began opening the packages, revealing their contents one by one. There were bolts of practical cotton in solid colors, a length of softer flannel for winter nightclothes, thread and needles, a pair of small boots for Ellie, and warm stockings for them both. But it was the last package that took Hannah's breath away. Inside lay a length of blue calico, patterned with tiny white flowers. It wasn't fancy by city standards, but to Hannah, who had worn nothing but plain homespun for years, it was beautiful. Yates, she breathed, running her fingers over the fabric. This wasn't on my list. He ducked his head, suddenly seeming embarrassed. Mrs. Patterson said every woman needs at least one pretty dress. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Hannah's eyes. She blinked them back, not wanting to embarrass him further. Thank you, it's lovely. A brief, warm smile was his only acknowledgement before he stood, gathering his hat. Better turn in, morning comes early. Hannah watched him go, the fabric still clutched in her hands. Beside her, Maggie sighed softly. That boy, the older woman murmured, almost to herself. Still waters run deep with that one. Hannah couldn't have agreed more. The Sunday service was held in the small clapboard church at the edge of the town of Cottonwood Creek, a collection of buildings that seemed more an idea of a town than an actual one. Hannah sat beside Yates in the family pew, Ellie between them, acutely aware of the curious glances from the other congregants. She'd worn the blue calico, which she'd stayed up late altering to fit her slender frame. Yates had given her an appreciative look when she descended the stairs that morning, his eyes warming in a way that made her cheeks flush. Now, as the parson delivered a sermon on neighborly love that seemed pointed in their direction, Hannah found herself stealing glances at Yates's profile. In his Sunday best, a dark coat over a clean white shirt, his hair neatly combed, he cut a striking figure. Several unmarried women in the congregation seemed to agree, judging by the coy looks cast in his direction. A pang of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy twisted in Hannah's chest. She had no claim on Yates, no right to feel possessive. And yet, after the service, they were immediately surrounded by curious neighbors, all eager to meet the woman and child staying at Valero Ranch. Hannah found herself repeating the story of the fire over and over, each telling scraping against the wound that was still raw. Yates stayed close, his steady presence a comfort as he fielded the more invasive questions and introduced her around. Hannah noticed how respected he seemed to be. Men deferred to him, women smiled warmly, and even the parson treated him with particular regard. Mr. Valero has been a pillar of this community since taking over the ranch after his father's passing, the parson explained when Hannah commented on it. Most generous donor to our church fund, and always the first to help when trouble strikes. I'm just learning that about him, Hannah said softly, watching as Yates lifted Ellie onto his shoulders to better see a hawk circling overhead. The parson followed her gaze, a knowing look crossing his face. He's a good man, Mrs. Dawson, one of the best I know. Please call me Hannah, she said automatically, still watching Yates with her son. Hannah, then. The parson patted her hand. And if you'll permit an old man, an observation, I haven't seen that particular light in Yates Valero's eyes since before he lost Claire. Before Hannah could respond to this startling statement, Yates rejoined them, Ellie still perched on his shoulders and chattering about the hawk. Parson, Yates greeted with a nod. Sermon hit the mark today. Glad to hear it, son, the parson smiled. Will we be seeing you at the harvest social next weekend? Yates glanced at Hannah, something like uncertainty flickering across his face. Haven't decided yet. Well, I hope you'll all come, the parson said, including Hannah in his smile. The whole town turns out, music, dancing, plenty of food. It's quite the event. After the parson moved on to greet other parishioners, Yates lowered Ellie to the ground. We should head back, he said. Weather's turning. Hannah looked up to see clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. She nodded, gathering her shawl closer around her shoulders. As they walked to the wagon, several people called out invitations to the harvest social, all directed at Yates but clearly including Hannah and Ellie. Each time, Yates responded noncommittally, his expression growing more closed with each exchange. It wasn't until they were on the road back to the ranch, Ellie dozed off between them on the wagon seat, that Hannah broached the subject. You don't want to go to the social, she observed, keeping her voice low so as not to wake her son. Yates's hands tightened on the reins. Didn't say that. You didn't have to. Hannah smoothed her skirt, choosing her words carefully. Is it because of us? Because you'd have to explain why we're staying with you? Yates shot her a surprised look. No, nothing like that. He sighed, his breath visible in the cooling air. Just haven't been to one since Claire died. Doesn't seem right somehow. Hannah understood immediately. The first time she'd attended a community event after Samuel's death had been excruciating. The pitying looks, the empty space beside her, the weight of absence heavier than any physical burden. The first time is the hardest, she said softly. But Ali would love it, I think, and it might be good, for both of us. Yates was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not respond. Finally, he said, been 5 years. Probably time I rejoined the living, as Maggie keeps telling me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. All right, we'll go. The simple we sent a rush of warmth through Hannah that had nothing to do with the heavy shawl around her shoulders. For the rest of the journey home, they rode in comfortable silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft breathing of the sleeping child between them. The day of the harvest social dawned clear and crisp, the autumn sun painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Hannah spent the morning helping Maggie prepare dishes to contribute apple pies made with fruit from the ranch's small orchard, and corn bread that Ali proudly declared he'd helped bake. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to depart, the wagon loaded with food and blankets for sitting. Hannah wore her blue calico again, having added a bit of lace Maggie had found in an old trunk to the collar. Ali was scrubbed clean, his hair slicked down with water that was already beginning to dry into its usual unruly waves. Yates appeared from the barn just as Hannah was settling Ali in the wagon. She turned at the sound of his approach and felt her breath catch. He wore a crisp white shirt with a dark vest and his best trousers, his hat set at a jaunty angle on his freshly trimmed hair. But it was the nervous smile he gave her that truly transformed him, making him look younger and somehow more approachable. You look beautiful, he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. Thank you, you look quite handsome yourself. Ali broke the moment by bouncing impatiently in the wagon. Can we go now? Miss Maggie says there'll be cake. Yates chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing. Can't keep a boy from cake, can we? Let's get moving. The social was held in the town square, a dusty open area surrounded by the few permanent buildings that comprised Cottonwood Creek. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a makeshift dance floor occupied the center. A small group of musicians, 2 fiddlers, a banjo player, and someone with a harmonica were already playing a lively tune as they arrived. Ali's eyes were wide as saucers as he took in the festivities. Can I go see? He asked, practically vibrating with excitement. Hannah hesitated, her instinct to keep him close warring with his obvious delight. Stay where I can see you, she finally agreed. They found a spot to spread their blanket near the edge of the gathering, close enough to participate but not so central as to be overwhelming. Almost immediately, they were approached by curious neighbors, most of whom Hannah had met briefly after the church service. Yates fielded the inquiries with practiced ease, his hand occasionally coming to rest on the small of Hannah's back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Each time, a small thrill ran through her, followed by guilt at her reaction. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah found herself relaxing, drawn into conversations with the other women about recipes and household matters. Ali made fast friends with several local children and was soon engaged in a game of tag that ranged around the perimeter of the gathering. Your boy's taking to town life just fine, observed a friendly woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. Jenkins. And how are you settling in at the Valero place? Very well, thank you, Hannah replied, watching as Yates helped an elderly man carry a heavy bench. Everyone has been most kind. Yates is a good man, Mrs. Jenkins said, following Hannah's gaze. Too long alone, if you ask me. That ranch needs a woman's touch and children's laughter. Hannah felt her cheeks warm. We're only staying until spring, she said quickly. Just until I can make other arrangements. Mrs. Jenkins gave her a knowing look. Of course, dear. That's what my Henry said when he asked me to stay at his place while my father was ill. 22 years ago, that was. She patted Hannah's hand. Sometimes the arrangements we make aren't the ones the good Lord has in mind. Before Hannah could formulate a response, the music changed to a slower tune and couples began moving to the dance floor. Yates appeared at her side, his expression unreadable. "Would you care to dance?" he asked formally, extending his hand. Hannah hesitated. She hadn't danced since before Samuel's death, and the thought of being held in another man's arms sent a confusing mix of emotions through her. But the hopeful look in Yates's eyes decided her. "I'd like that," she said softly, placing her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused, as he led her to the edge of the dance floor. With gentle confidence, he drew her into his arms, one hand resting respectfully at her waist, the other holding hers at shoulder height. "Been a while," he admitted as they began to move with the music. Might be rusty, but he wasn't. Yates led with the same quiet assurance he brought to everything, guiding her through the steps of the waltz with unexpected grace for such a powerful man. Hannah was acutely aware of him, the clean scent of soap and leather, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the solid strength of his chest just inches from her own. They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before, finding a rhythm that seemed as natural as breathing. "You're good at this," she said, surprised to find herself breathless. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "My mother insisted all her sons learn to dance properly, said a man who could dance would never lack for female company. And did that prove true?" Hannah asked, immediately regretting the forward question, but Yates just chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Can't say it hurt, though I never much cared for socializing until..." He trailed off, but Hannah understood, until Claire. She felt a pang of sympathy, knowing how loss could reshape a person's entire world. "She must have been remarkable," Hannah said softly. Yates's steps faltered slightly before he recovered. "She was. Kind, beautiful, full of life." His eyes met Hannah's, surprisingly open. "Like you." The simple comparison stole Hannah's breath. Before she could respond, the music ended, and Yates stepped back, releasing her from his embrace but keeping hold of her hand. "Thank you for the dance," he said formally, but his eyes told a different story, one of awakening interest and dawning possibility. Hannah could only nod, too overcome by the intensity of the moment to form words. They returned to their blanket in silence, both aware that something had shifted between them. As the evening progressed and lanterns were lit around the square, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Hannah found herself hyper-aware of Yates's presence beside her, the brush of his arm against hers as he reached for a cup, the way his eyes sought hers across conversations. He eventually tired himself out and fell asleep on the blanket, his head pillowed on Hannah's lap. As the hour grew late and families began to depart, Yates leaned close to her. "Should we head back?" he asked, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping child. Hannah nodded, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end despite her fatigue. Yates gathered Illy into his arms with practiced gentleness, the boy barely stirring as he was transferred from Hannah's lap to Yates's strong embrace. They said their goodbyes, promising to attend church the following Sunday, and made their way back to the wagon. Yates settled Illy on the seat between them, the boy immediately curling against Hannah's side without waking. The ride home was quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional call of a night bird. The moon was nearly full, bathing the prairie in silvery light that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Hannah stole glances at Yates's profile as he drove, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders against the night sky. When had she started to see him this way? When had gratitude and friendship begun to transform into something more complicated, more frightening? "Penny for your thoughts," Yates said suddenly, his eyes still on the road ahead. Hannah startled, caught in her contemplation. "I was just thinking about how quickly things can change," she admitted. "A month ago I thought I knew what my life would be, and now. Yates prompted when she didn't continue. Hannah looked down at Illy, sleeping peacefully against her. "Now everything is uncertain, except that I need to do what's best for him." Yates nodded, his expression thoughtful, And what do you think that is? What's best for him? It was a question Hannah had been asking herself with increasing frequency. Stability, she said finally. Safety. A place where he can grow up knowing he's loved and cared for. She hesitated, then added softly, a home. The ranch could be that, Yates said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the creak of the wagon wheels. If you wanted. Hannah's heart stuttered in her chest. Was he suggesting what she thought he was? She searched for words, finding none that adequately expressed the tumult of emotions his statement had evoked. Yates seemed to sense her confusion. I'm not asking for anything, Hannah, just offering a possibility, something to consider. He glanced at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. No rush, no pressure, just think about it. They reached the ranch before Hannah could formulate a response, and the moment slipped away in the practicalities of carrying a sleeping child inside and preparing for bed. But as she lay awake that night, listening to Ellie's soft breathing beside her, Hannah couldn't stop turning Yates's words over in her mind. The ranch could be that, if you wanted, a home, a future, a second chance at happiness. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. Was she ready to open her heart again, to risk the pain of loss a second time? And what of Samuel's memory? Would accepting a new life with Yates somehow dishonor what they had shared? Questions without answers swirled in her mind until exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her into a dreamless sleep. The weeks following the harvest social settled into a comfortable routine. Hannah took over more of the household duties from Maggie, who seemed grateful for the help as the weather turned colder and her joints grew stiffer. Ellie spent his days learning the workings of the ranch, trailing after Yates or the hands with boundless enthusiasm. And Yates. Yates was a steady presence, reliable as the sunrise. He never pushed, never pressed for an answer to his unspoken question, but Hannah caught him watching her sometimes with a warmth in his eyes that made her heart race. Small changes began to appear around the ranch. A swing appeared one morning, hanging from the sturdy oak outside the kitchen window. A rocking chair, polished to a warm glow, was placed beside the fireplace in the main room. Books that Maggie said had belonged to Claire were brought down from the attic and arranged on a shelf within easy reach. Each gesture spoke volumes about Yates's intentions, his hope that they might stay. And each day, Hannah found it harder to imagine leaving when spring arrived. On a crisp December morning, Hannah woke to the sound of excited whispers outside her door. She opened it to find Ellie and Yates in the hallway, both looking guilty and pleased with themselves. "What are you two plotting?" she asked, unable to keep the smile from her face at the sight of them together, heads bent in conspiracy. "Nothing, Mama," Ellie said with exaggerated innocence. "Mr. Yates was just showing me how to, Check for loose floorboards," Yates supplied, his expression so earnest that Hannah had to laugh. "I see. Well, I hope our floor passes inspection." She ruffled Ellie's hair affectionately. "Go wash up for breakfast, young man." After Ellie scampered off, Hannah raised an eyebrow at Yates. "Loose floorboards," he had the grace to look sheepish. "Not my best excuse. Truth is, we've been working on a surprise for you." "A surprise?" Yates nodded, a boyish excitement lighting his face. "It's almost finished. Another day or two if the weather holds." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you trust me, Hannah?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it wasn't. Somewhere along the line, this man had earned her complete trust without her even realizing it. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." Something shifted in his expression, relief, perhaps, or resolve. "Good, that's good," he cleared his throat. "We should get to breakfast before Maggie comes looking for us." 2 days later, after the morning chores were done, Yates appeared at the kitchen door where Hannah was helping Maggie prepare lunch. "Got a minute?" he asked, his expression a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron, looking to Maggie, who shooed her away with a knowing smile. "Go on, I can finish here." Outside, Hannah found Ellie bouncing on his toes beside the wagon, already hitched to a pair of horses. "Is it time for the surprise, Mr. Yates?" He called as they approached. "It is indeed, little man." Yates helped Hannah up to the seat, then lifted Ellie beside her before climbing up himself. "Both of you close your eyes now, no peeking until I say." Hannah exchanged an amused glance with her son before obediently closing her eyes. She felt the wagon start moving, heard Ellie giggle beside her as they bounced along. After what seemed like a long time but was probably only 15 minutes, the wagon came to a stop. "Keep those eyes closed," Yates instructed as he helped them down. "Just a few more steps." Hannah felt Ellie's small hand slip into hers as Yates led them forward, his own warm hand at the small of her back guiding her. The ground beneath her feet changed from the packed earth of the road to what felt like a wooden platform. "All right," Yates said, his voice tight with anticipation. "Open your eyes." Hannah did and gasped. They were standing on the porch of a small cabin, newly built from the look of the raw timber. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and curtains which she recognized as ones Maggie had been hemming in secret hung in the windows. Yates. She breathed, unable to form a coherent thought. "It's ours, Mama," Ellie cried, tugging at her hand. "Mr. Yates built it for us. Come see inside." He pulled her through the door, revealing a cozy interior with a main room centered around a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. Simple furniture, some new, some she recognized from the ranch house, was arranged comfortably, and a fire crackled in the hearth, warming the space. "Do you like it?" Yates asked from behind her, his voice uncertain. "It's not as big as the main house, but I thought maybe you'd prefer something of your own, somewhere that's just yours but still on the ranch, so you don't feel obligated." Hannah turned to face him, tears blurring her vision. "You built this for us?" Yates nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Been working on it whenever I could steal time." The hands helped, of course, and Maggie handled the furnishings. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. "If you don't like it, or if it's not what you want." "It's perfect," Hannah interrupted, her voice breaking. "It's absolutely perfect, Yates." Relief washed over his features, followed by something deeper, more intense. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a horse, more detailed and refined than the one he'd given Ellie. "Made this for you." Hannah took it, turning the beautiful piece over in her hands. It was exquisitely crafted, each line and curve capturing the grace and power of a running horse. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But why?" "Turn it over," Yates instructed softly. Hannah did as he asked and found words carved into the base. "Stay, please." Her eyes flew to his face, finding naked hope and vulnerability there. "Yates, I know it's soon," he said quickly. "I know you're still healing, still figuring things out. And I would never presume to replace what you had with Samuel, but Hannah." He drew a deep breath, then reached for her hands, enfolding them and the carved horse within his own. "Since the night I found you and Ellie by that fire, something's been changing in me. Something I thought was dead and buried along with Claire. You've brought light back into my life, both of you, and I find myself hoping, praying that maybe I've done the same for you." Hannah's heart pounded in her chest as Yates continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I'm not asking for promises right now, just asking you to consider staying, not as my guest or as someone I helped, but as whatever you want to be." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "We could take it slow, see where it leads. And in time, if things develop the way I hope they might." He trailed off, leaving the possibility unspoken but clear in his eyes. Ellie, who had been exploring the cabin during this exchange, suddenly reappeared at Hannah's side. "Can we stay, Mama? Mr. Yates even made me a bedroom with a big boy bed and everything." Hannah looked down at her son's eager face, then back to Yates's hopeful one. In that moment, she saw the future stretched out before her, mornings at the breakfast table with both of them, evenings by the fire, seasons passing in a rhythm of work and rest and togetherness. It was a future she hadn't dared to imagine after losing Samuel, one that now seemed not just possible but right. "Yes," she said, the word coming easily, naturally. "Yes, we'll stay." Joy bloomed across Yates's face, transforming it completely. With gentle reverence, he raised one of her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Ellie whooped with excitement, throwing his arms around both their legs in an exuberant hug that made them laugh. As Hannah gazed down at the top of her son's head, then up at Yates's face, She felt something settle within her, a certainty, a rightness that had been missing for so long. They spent the afternoon exploring the cabin, Illy racing from room to room with boundless energy, while Yates pointed out features he'd included with them in mined shelves built at Hannah's height in the kitchen. A special nook for Illy's toys, a window seat where Hannah could sit and sew in the afternoon light. As the sun began to set, they reluctantly prepared to return to the main house for dinner. Yates helped Illy into the wagon while Hannah took one last look around the cabin, their cabin. "We can move in whenever you're ready," Yates said, coming to stand beside her in the doorway. "No rush." Hannah turned to him, finding courage in the steady support he'd shown these past months. "Yates, I need to ask, what happens if?" She searched for the right words. "If this doesn't work out the way you hope, if we can't." Understanding softened his features. "Then you still have a home here for as long as you want it. No conditions, no expectations." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I meant what I said, Hannah. We take this as slow as you need. And if friendship is all you ever want from me, that will be enough." But even as he said it, Hannah knew it wouldn't be enough, not for her, and certainly not for him. Because the warmth that spread through her at his touch wasn't friendly at all. It was something deeper, more primal, something she'd thought she'd never feel again. Acting on impulse, she stepped closer and placed a hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat quicken beneath her palm. "And if I want more than friendship?" she asked softly. "Eventually." Yates's eyes darkened, his breath catching audibly. "Then I would be the happiest man in the territory," he said, his voice a low rumble that she felt as much as heard. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head. Hannah tilted her face up to meet him, and their lips came together in a kiss that was gentle yet electric, tentative yet promising. It was brief, just a moment of connection before they pulled apart, aware of Illy waiting in the wagon. But it was enough to confirm what Hannah had already begun to suspect. Her heart, which she'd thought shattered beyond repair, was healing. And in the process, it was making room for someone new. "We should go," Yates said, though he made no move to step away. "Maggie will be wondering where we are." Hannah nodded but reached up to touch his cheek, needing one more moment of contact. "Thank you, not just for the cabin, but for everything." Yates turned his head to press a kiss against her palm. "No need for thanks, Hannah, just having you and Illy here. It's more than I dared hope for." As they walked hand in hand to the wagon, where Illy waited impatiently, Hannah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future was uncertain, it always had been, even when she thought she knew what it held. But for the first time since the fire that had destroyed her homestead, she found herself looking forward to that uncertainty with anticipation rather than dread. They moved into the cabin the following week, a simple affair that involved the ranch hands cheerfully carrying their few possessions from the main house to their new home. Maggie insisted on hosting a small housewarming, preparing enough food to feed an army and inviting the closest neighbors to welcome them properly. As winter deepened, Hannah and Illy settled into a rhythm of life on the ranch. Illy thrived under Yates's gentle guidance, soaking up knowledge about animals and ranch work like a sponge. Hannah found purpose in caring for their home and helping Maggie with the larger household, while also contributing her skills with needle and thread to repair clothing and make new curtains for the ranch house. And Yates was true to his word. He was present but never pressuring, attentive but respectful of her space and independence. He took to joining them for dinner most evenings, sometimes staying afterward to read to Illy or simply talk with Hannah by the fire after the boy was in bed. Each day, Hannah found herself growing more comfortable with his presence, more attuned to his moods and expressions. She learned that the slight furrow between his brows meant he was worried about the weather, that the way he rubbed the back of his neck signaled tiredness, that the softness in his eyes when he watched Illy was a reflection of the father he had longed to be. And gradually, without her quite realizing when it happened, she fell in love with him. The realization came on a quiet evening in late January. A winter storm had rolled in, bringing howling winds and driving snow that had confined everyone to the main house for safety. Illy had long since fallen asleep in one of the spare bedrooms, exhausted from a day of indoor games with the ranch hands. Hannah sat before the fire in the main room, working on a quilt while Yates whittled nearby. The soft scrape of his knife against wood a soothing counterpoint to the wind outside. The companionable silence between them was broken only occasionally by a comment or question, easy and natural as breathing. Looking up from her stitching, Hannah found herself studying his profile, admiring the play of firelight across his features. As if sensing her gaze, Yates glanced up, a slow smile spreading across his face when he found her watching him. "What?" he asked, setting aside his carving. "Nothing," Hannah replied, suddenly shy. "Just thinking." "About?" He shifted closer, his knee brushing against hers. Hannah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About how different everything is from what I expected. When Samuel died, I thought that was the end of certain things, love, happiness, a family." She looked down at her hands, twisting together in her lap. "I thought I'd raise Ellie alone, that we'd make do, survive. I never imagined. A second chance," Yates supplied when she faltered. Hannah nodded. "It feels wrong sometimes, like I'm betraying him by being happy again." Yates reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Do you think Samuel would want you to be alone, to deny yourself and Ellie the chance for happiness?" Hannah shook her head immediately. Samuel had been loving, generous. He would have wanted her to live fully, not half a life in the shadow of grief. No, he'd want us to be happy. "And are you?" Yates asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Happy." Hannah met his gaze, seeing the vulnerability there, the need for reassurance that matched her own. "Yes," she said simply. "More than I thought possible." Something fierce and tender flared in Yates's eyes. Slowly, he raised a hand to cup her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I love you, Hannah," he said, the words hanging in the air between them, simple and profound. "I think I have since that first night when I saw you trying to shield Ellie from the fire. Your courage, your devotion. Everything about you called to something in me I thought was long dead." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, not of grief but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both new and familiar on her tongue. "I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I do." Yates drew her to him then, his kiss deeper and more certain than their first tentative exchange. Hannah responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck as she surrendered to the feelings she'd been holding at bay for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words somewhere between a question and a plea. "Be my wife, Hannah. Let me be a father to Ellie. Let us build a life together here on this land." Hannah's heart soared at the words she'd secretly been longing to hear. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Yates, I'll marry you." Joy transformed his face as he gathered her in his arms again, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, safe in his embrace with the storm raging outside and love blooming within, Hannah knew she had found her way home. They were married in the spring, when the prairie was alive with wildflowers and new growth. The small church in Cottonwood Creek was filled to capacity. Every neighbor and friend for miles around gathered to witness the union of two people who had found love in the aftermath of loss. Ellie stood proudly beside them, dressed in his Sunday best, his role as ring-bearer taken with utmost seriousness. When the parson asked who gave this woman to be married, it was Ellie who stepped forward and said in a clear voice, "I do, sir, me and my pa in heaven." There wasn't a dry eye in the church after that, least of all Hannah's. But her tears were joyful ones, filled with gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment and this man. Yates had never looked more handsome than he did standing before the altar in his new suit, his blue eyes never leaving hers as they spoke their vows. When he slid the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, his hands were steady, his voice firm with conviction. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, the traditional words weighted with personal meaning. "With my body I thee worship, with my heart I thee cherish, in sickness and in health, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, as long as we both shall live." After the ceremony, the entire community gathered at Valero Ranch for a celebration that lasted well into the night. Tables groaned with food, fiddle music filled the air, and children ran laughing through the grass while their parents danced and feasted. Through it all, Yates kept Hannah close, his hand finding hers whenever they were separated for even a moment. And when the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, he led her away from the festivities to a quiet spot beneath the old oak tree. "Happy, Mrs. Valero?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as she leaned back against his chest. "Perfectly," Hannah replied, covering his hands with her own. "Though I think he might be even happier. I've never seen a boy eat so much cake." Yates chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "He's growing." Boys his age need fuel. Hannah turned in his arms, looking up into the face of the man who had become her husband. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For finding us that night, for bringing us home with you, for loving us both so well." Yates's expression softened. "No thanks needed for that, Hannah. Loving you and Ali is as natural as breathing." He brushed a tender kiss across her lips. "And as necessary." As twilight deepened into night and the celebration continued behind them, Hannah rested in her husband's arms, content in the knowledge that out of the ashes of her former life, something beautiful and enduring had risen, a love strong enough to weather any storm, a family forged in fire and tempered by time. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hannah offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the man who had found them on that desperate night, for the cowboy who had said, "You're both coming home with me," and in doing so had given them not just shelter, but a future filled with hope and love. 5 years later, Hannah stood on the porch of the main house, watching as Yates led 10-year-old Ali through the basics of roping. The boy had grown tall and strong, his features a blend of Samuel's and her own, but his confident stance and the careful way he handled the rope were pure Yates. Beside them, 3-year-old Claire Valero giggled as she tried to mimic her big brother, her small hands clutching a shortened piece of rope that she swung in wild circles over her head. At just 2, the twins, Samuel and Joseph, toddled after their sister, determined to join in despite their wobbly legs. Hannah's hand came to rest on the gentle swell of her belly, where their 5th child, another girl, according to Maggie's confident prediction, was beginning to make her presence known. The ranch had never been so full of life and laughter, the legacy of love that had begun on that fateful night continuing to grow and flourish. As if sensing her thoughts, Yates looked up, his smile still capable of making her heart skip a beat after all these years. He said something to Ali, who nodded and continued practicing on his own, then crossed the yard to join her on the porch. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, his hand covering hers over her belly. "Just fine," Hannah replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though your daughter seems determined to become a dancer. She hasn't stopped moving all day." Yates laughed, the sound warming her as it always did. "That's my girl, strong and spirited just like her mama." Hannah turned in his arms, studying the face she had come to know better than her own. Time had added a few lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but the warmth in his gaze remained unchanged, a beacon of love that had guided her through every joy and challenge of their life together. "I love you, Yates Valero," she said simply, the words no less true for having been spoken countless times before. "And I love you, Hannah Valero," he replied, bending to capture her lips in a kiss that still held all the tenderness and passion of their first. From the yard came the sound of children's laughter, the future they had built together from the ashes of separate pasts. And as Yates drew her close, his strong arms sheltering her as they had on that first desperate night, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home, in every sense of the word. The fire that had threatened to destroy everything had instead forged a bond stronger than steel, a love tempered by shared joys and sorrows, a family built on the foundation of second chances and unwavering faith in each other. And as the sun began its descent over the rolling prairie that had witnessed their journey, Hannah offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the path that had led her here to this man, these children, this life. A life more abundant, more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine from the ashes of that long-ago night when a stranger on horseback had appeared in the darkness and changed everything with 7 simple words. "You're both coming home with me."